So thank you for joining. And first of all, I would like this to be not purely a tech talk. So anytime you have any questions or things you want to share about general approach to music, you know, I also run a record label, etc. Just feel free to come in the conversation. And tonight on the tech side, I brought a few of my studio favorites. There is here a good old Korg MS-20, its own native sequencer, the Korg SQ10, which is a very special sequencer because it's in a way kind of very limited, but as all the most limited machines are to me the most interesting, some of them. And this is quite special because, as you can see from its own architecture, it's built not on 8 or 16 steps, but actually on 12 steps, which let's say, of course, you can also use it on 8 steps and do the classic 8-bar loops thing. But let's say when you have, and this is one of the main points for me, like when you have in front of you a fixed architecture, automatically your brain starts to work with that. So even if you can do the 8 steps, you still have in front of you a fixed structure that is built to have 12 steps per sequence. And there is something that works somehow subconsciously, at least in my brain, when I produce, when I'm in front of those, let's call them fixed machines, let's say. And this one, which is the Korg MS-50, which originally was meant as an expander for the MS-20. So the MS-20 is one of the most classic mono synths. You might know it as being quite famous, made also very famous by people like Aphex Twin and company from the old school Warp records. And not only because it has been used a lot into some very early hip-hop electro stuff, and it's a very, very intense and interesting machine. And as you can see, the architecture of it is like, in a way, is a fixed synth. So there are like 2 oscillators, the mixer for the 2 oscillators, a high-pass filter, a low-pass filter, a whole bunch of modulation possibilities, and 2 envelope generators. But there is also this little part here which makes it a semi-modular synth. So while part of the synth is pre-patched, that means it's a kind of hardwired, so pre-connected, let's say. So the things can already run properly just as it is with this section. In this section, you can play around moving these pre-made connections, so to kind of change the way things are routed into each other. And this gives a huge, huge amount of possibilities for very different things we can do. Here, what I did is to bring on the MS-20. I already prepared a patch, as you can see, while on the SQ10 and on the MS-50, it's completely empty because I would like to do kind of all together here something new out of it. First of all, talking about, let's say, let's start with this MS-20 and with why I did this patch here. It's because, like, once again, I truly believe that the most interesting things, at least for me in the studio, comes always when I do have very strict limitations. So I am not the kind of producer that like run always to the last technology, to the last platform, to the last thing. Like I normally use, for example, Ableton Live, which is a great tool, but I use it mostly just as an arrangement. So just pretty much as a multi-track recorder. But pretty much everything you hear in my productions, really, probably, I'm not joking, 95% of anything you hear in my production comes from this kind of machines, and that works just as Ableton works just as a very flexible recording and arrangement device. Also, because there is something that is to me a little bit paradoxical, but it is very true to me. The fact that, like, the more, like, for example, Ableton and the whole digital world offer immense amount of possibilities, but I often also, as a record label owner, when I get a lot of demos and as a DJ with the promos, it's like I can almost immediately recognize a track that sounds like Ableton Live, you know? And that's I never really found the answer to this, but there must be something in this having in front of you this endless amount of possibility that makes it in a way very normalized, that you hear that maybe because of all those possibilities, people tend to attach to a fashion. Like, right now, this is the sound that I like, or that is fashionable, and so I try to do with those tools this. And so they kind of anyway find, I find that producers often kind of narrow their creative line into those fashionable paths, you know. While when you have limited machines, you know, and there is a reason why machines like the 303, the 808 has been so seminal in the electronic music industry. It's because you really push them to the limits, you know, and in a way you stick to certain walls, to certain, I call them archetypes. So like you have a machine that gives you these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 factors, and you have no other possibilities than playing with those 6 factors. And I find it very interesting when these possibilities are very limited, so that you can really put your efforts into folding the machine to your will, you know, into folding the sound to your own, creative ideas, you know, musical ideas. So for example, I did this patch to give you, just a little example of how one synth that is known to be a classic mono synth can also not be that, let's say. So the patch I built, that if you're curious I can also explain in detail, it's a patch to show you how I, for example, managed to do of a very limited mono synth an actual stereo panoramic ambient pad, for example. And I'll show you just the sound of it. You see, this is theoretically a mono synth, but it's running on a stereo panoramic channel and works as a pretty much as a polyphonic, or at least a 2 voices plus a sub oscillator synthesizer. And first of all, on all this, is there any questions, any inputs you want to give me? Not yet? Shall we go on? Yes. You mean for the mix down of my tracks? Like once the track is done and arranged, like record, then not really, not very, very few ones. Maybe The only thing that is very handy, for example, is equalizers, because otherwise that would force you to have an immense amount. But still, most of the time, I tend to have my mix downs out of the box, so I output the different channels or different groups from Ableton into an external mainboard mixer, and I do part of the equalization there, and then the really last tiny part, I help myself with some digital EQs. But most of the time, yeah, I avoid that also because I have the feeling that when you start like kind of distributing digital equalizers over all the tracks, you don't hear it on a single track, but when it's about the whole spectrum, at the end I always feel like I lost something in the track, you know, there's something that is really not there anymore, you know what I mean? And so I really try to avoid that, you know, to use effects, yeah, also in a very minimal way, because most of the time, let's say, I record the individual, so my production process works like I start like playing around with synths. When there's something that I find interesting, I record it, and normally it's already all the effects are already inside that signals. So that particular synth line already is passing through a whole series of pedals and overdubbing and things like this, you know, that I can kind of show you tonight, but we can't fully replicate because, yeah, the mixer is a too basic version of what I use in the studio to be able to really do live dubbing in the Lee Scratch Perry sense, meaning like using the mixer as a synthesizer, almost as a sound machine, you know, because yeah, once again, it's always interesting to me to use yeah, things in different ways. That's why I find it so fascinating, both the whole Jamaican dub culture as well as the Japanese, this extreme noise of no input genre of music, where they play pretty much with mixer with no instruments plugged in, you know, so they just play on a huge amount of feedbacks and things like this, pushing the gains to the extreme and allowing one channel to pass to the other, filtering and stuff. And that's when you those are interesting tools. It's not stuff that honestly I would listen in my afternoons because it's quite intense, but I can find myself using the same tools into a more techno realm, you know. Yeah. Yeah, I see, for example, also how when you hear a certain kind of techno, I don't know, the old production from Moritz von Oswald, for example, for the whole basic channel thing, they really sound it's always impressive to me, you know, because it sounds really even if it's not really about loudness, it's really the vastity of those bass lines and things, and this is only possible thanks to overdubbing. So to really use the mixer as a multi-layering machine, you know, so that sometimes you even get to have some spontaneous, strange compression effects when the signals start to fight to get to the threshold one against the other. You know what I mean? That's a very interesting thing. Yeah. And that's, yeah, for example, tonight what we could do is to play a little bit with just some pure sine waves, also to show from MS-20 and MS-50 how purely playing with very simple waveforms, but putting them together almost tuned in the same way, can bring to really beautiful droning processing. Yeah. Anything else before we go on? Hello. What kind of feeling? Yeah, I don't know. They are like little human beings for me. Like, actually, it's like I always say, like, part of the tracks I do, part of the tracks is the machine. Sometimes it's and that's why I like so much. For me, the love for vintage machines is not so much about like, oh, how cool is to have vintage machines. It's mostly about the fact that like a lot of components are sometimes like literally decaying. You know what I mean? Like, so You don't have this perfect tuning. Sometimes you have this surprise effects happening, and sometimes that surprise effect is what I end up cutting from the rest and putting in a final track. You know what I mean? Like, because it's I don't know, makes it something very special, unpredictable. You know? Yeah. Yes. So, for example, going on the more nerdy technical side, what you heard here, how to transform a monosynth like this into a polyphonic. We have actually, from the normal system, what I did, if I remember, is to, for example, connect the keyboard CV out to the voltage controlled low pass filter. That means that already the keyboard, the upper you go, the more it will automatically open your filter. And this gives like from the very closed to the very open, fully open filter. In between, halfway. Yeah. And not to go too much in crazy details, but on the MS-20 you can always control the amount of this extra modulation you give through the patch bay here, through these knobs down there. So the cutoff frequency modulation and the external inputs amounts, let's say. So this was a first step. Then what happened is to actually give to the other output that is supposed to be just a phone's output, so a queuing output, to bring it to its own external signal processor. So I brought the phone's output into here, which is the external signal processor input, set up a little bit the parameter, which is just like signal input, the high cut frequency, because this part can give you also some nice distortion, but that wasn't interesting for this kind of pad. And and bringing the output to this second channel, panning them, the main one to the left, the phone one to the right, already to have some kind of stereo panorama. And then there is another thing, that is to connect the VCO to the envelope generator, of course, and to bring also the control of the wheel here to the actually high pass filter. And the high pass filter, if you can see here, it's actually not acting really as a filter, but it's actually as a third oscillator. Because if you see the filter here, is there light enough here? Yeah, the filter here is very closed, and the peak, so the resonance, is at max. That means the filter is self-oscillating. So I'm using it just as this other very low note. The one you hear below, the sub. That is always the same as a sub-oscillator. It doesn't matter where I go with the notes, it's always there. So it acts as a two-voice oscillator, a synth now, plus a sub-oscillator with this kind of trick. That's once again using tools that are not meant to be used like that, in a more creative way to do what you want to do. So right now what you're hearing is the two oscillators together, just simply tuned, one as the main note here, and the other 1/5 up. You know, this, if I turn down, so like this, I turn down the volume of the two oscillators, you're hearing just a sub-oscillator. So the high pass filter that is self-oscillating, that is the same everywhere. Then the first VCO. Now, what you're hearing now, it's actually very interesting. It's one of those surprises I was talking about. Do you hear this like this very strong oscillation. This happens when you superpose two sine waves that are very, very close to each other in tune, but not exactly. That's what start to create those kind of butterfly bass effect that are a very main point of most of the most interesting drone and ambient music for me. But anyway, aside this parenthesis, we bring up also the second oscillator, which is 1/5 up, to give this kind of extra note. All this just to show you how you can always, transform many instruments into something else, let's say. Now let's go to try and build something kind of from scratch. We start, I think, with the MS-50. So this we do some live patching instead. And we start, for example, on the MS-50. First of all, it's a very good example of like learning synthesizer, because it's extremely clear in its sections. So we have VCO, so a classic voice generator, so a wave generator, a low pass filter, VCA, so an amplifier, 2 envelope generators, 1 modulation generators with which in more less Korg language means pretty much more complex LFO generation, so low frequency oscillations. In case you are not familiar with that, low frequency oscillation is an oscillation that is so slow that your hearing sense cannot catch it as sound, but it's so slow that you can use it for functions, so to kind of control certain modulations. We had some adding amplifier, which is some kind of 3 channels mixer, pretty much. A voltage supply in which I can carefully add voltage by voltage how much I want very precisely. Sample and hold, other functions that right now we don't need to go too much in detail with. So what I will do, for example, is first of all, we want to hear very basic sine wave. Okay. So what I did now is simply to connect the output of the sine wave into the input of our amplifier, and the amplifier is going to the mixer, as simple as it is. We can tune it, and first of all, the first thing I would like to do is to filter it until because you don't have a pure sine wave output on this mixer. I will try to kind of somehow create it through filtering. So first I go from the oscillator into the filter, and then actually let's take a shorter cable. And then again the output into where we were into the already we're getting closer to a sine wave, to a more soft forms of wave. The peak as almost a slight distortion thing to have this kind of already 2 voices situation. And as you feel this kind of woo 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 woo, it's what I always find very interesting in playing with bass frequencies, that you can probably hear quite a lot in the stuff I release. It's a very simple system, but it's very beautiful in terms of harmonics. Because, for example, if together with that, now I think we're done with this patch, so I can just undo it completely and bring on another two pure oscillators from the MS-20. The tune that allows these vibrations to we were talking about to happen. This is already sounding interesting to me in terms of harmonics. Because if you hear, when I slightly change the pitch, it also start to change this kind of almost ghost rhythm that is behind this oscillation. So you hear just the waves starting to cross in different waves, which is for me really the secret of very beautiful ambient and drone stuff. I give you an example of how this speed change just by changing the pitch. Going faster, going slower. They're going to right now two different channels. There's the MS-20 going in one and the MS-50 going in another. Yeah. Huh? Both in mono. Yeah. But when you have this kind of drone situations and you want and you don't have the problem that of already thinking I need to press this on vinyl, because that's kind of an issue with the bass frequencies, you can already distribute one and the other to the right and to the left to have a very beautiful panorama feeling, you know. The problem when you press this kind of low frequencies on vinyl is that going into stereo on such low frequencies can be very problematic for the vinyl cut, you know, because you still have to make at least below 150 hertz, so the very low part of the spectrum in mono. Otherwise, you cannot cut a proper lacquer. But I can show you how it sounds putting it in stereo, for example. For example, if I was to record a more drone track or some more droning parts of something that could be even techno, I would already record this kind of variations until I find the right ones for me, so that I can find certain harmonic content, so notes changing without going to the classic like chromatic scale. But what I'm doing now is playing more on the microtonal realm, so where you have pure when the oscillation is purely free of going from one place to another of the frequency spectrum, while when you use quantization, so that means for example that a sequencer will order your synth voice to just go into those frequencies that correspond to the Western chromatic scale, you will have, instead of this ooh, you will have do 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 do, like each one on one of the semitones of the chromatic scale. While for me it's very interesting to play with the more psychedelic part of psychoacoustic, which is mainly microtones and how they can play together, creating a whole series of harmonics, subharmonics, and overtones that are, how to say, fresher, newer, and different. They really, every time, completely unique. That's why they emotionally struck, at least they struck me, you know. So consider, I might seem like a freak, but with what you heard, I could already spend literally hours in the studio massaging myself with this kind of very low drone frequencies until a certain part of that recording, in the end, will end up in a track that will have an harmonic content that is not classic or already heard or sounding, how to say, basic, because responding to a certain chromatic scale. And there is also, to me, also a almost philosophical or almost sociological issue with using the chromatic scale. That is like the mainstream word, you know, the pop philosophy of not just music but of life and things. It's very present all the time, and I honestly can really feel it. You know, it's something that it's very heavy on me. And to me, like as when I say like techno, for me is not a genre of music, but it's more like an approach to things, you know, approach to music in a certain way. The same goes with when I talk about pop culture, because when we play in the chromatic scale, even if you don't consciously know, I'm really convinced that we are so bombed by that pop content everywhere that you end up somehow, your brain end up accepting certain dogmas. So the pop word works like this, works like happiness is a feeling, and we tell you how that should sound. Sadness is this other feeling, and we tell you that sadness should sound like this, with this series of harmonics followed in this certain way. Something dramatic should sound in this way. And that's a classic, this kind of pre-packaged emotions. It's a very classic system of most of our mainstream Western culture. So for me, playing with microtones and pure oscillators, as you heard, left free of any chromatic restraints, it's in a way, you know, my own way of having a act of rebellion to that, of saying like, no, actually I can express those feelings in this other millions of ways, you know. And that's for me what also struck me of the electronic music that I love the most, you know. I think most of us, I guess, if you are here, it's because you know my music, my stuff, and if you know my music and my stuff, probably as me, you've been into, at some point in your life, into the selected ambient works by Aphex Twin, I'm quite sure. And if you try to remember the first time you heard that, I was really in that age. I was like probably 14 or so, when I didn't have much access to any underground output of music. So when I heard that, I was really like, at the beginning, almost like disturbed. I was like, this is moving too much stuff in me. Like it's uncontrollable. Why is that? And it took me a long time to understand that, like, that was a process of liberation. Just by listening to that was already a process of liberation from this whole series of mainstream and pop culture strategies that are actually strategies. It's like really literally people sitting around a round table deciding these things, you know. It's not imaginations, because there is a whole economy and industry that works following those dogmas, you know. So try it out, drone synths and free oscillations. It's really liberating of all of that. So any questions, because before we start to go on and experiment with some more stuff? Hi.
Do you lose any of this interference, the wobbly feeling, the rhythmical thing, when you record it on a digital platform?
Depends how you record it, of course, and with what kind of, because now if your question is about the recording quality and the audio loss, you know, in recording,
Not loss, but more like a physical aspect of it.
yeah, you know,
Physical thing.
you sometimes do, even though you can be just careful with what kind of converters you use, because some converters can still be a guarantee of a very, very minimal, almost not audible loss of those physical impact, because what you're losing when you lose the physical impact is the frequencies below 40 hertz, pretty much, because that's what your ear cannot recognize as sound, but move your belly, you know. That's why we're so addicted to those dark places, you know. So, and that is, of course, mainly in dance music and in drone music, probably the most important aspect, you know. Sometimes I feel like over the years, things and fashions in the dance music change, but there is this one thing that is always common, which is like the low frequency range. That is constantly there, constantly very present, and because it's part of that attraction of that is really the physical movement. So I do try to be extremely careful in not impacting that when there is the whole process of like first recording. But it's not just that. Then it's like the mix down and other exports, and then like a mastering session and another export. Like in each of these stages, you have to really be careful how things get passed over, you know, like because at each of this stage, you often people don't even know what kind of equipment in a mastering studio they're using, you know, like, and I honestly never ever since many years mastered anything while I'm not present there, and I'm hearing like, hey, wait a second, this sounds cool, sounds powerful, but that disappeared. Why? And yeah, there's you know, one has to always be very curious and attentive with those things, with to avoid those kind of losses, because mainly in dance music and in electronic music, that's a huge part of it, you know. So I normally try to use very high-end converters. It's like for me that is extremely important in the studio. So if there is one place where I want to invest money and energies, is really to make sure the sound path is as intact as possible, you know. Well, I like a lot the old Lynx Aurora. Yeah, Lynx Aurora is to me some of the best ever done, to not going to like kind of cinema production kind of budget to get a converter, you know. But for what I do, I have to say with the Lynx Aurora, I never had issues of any kind. Like also when I, because these kind of things like drawn like this almost sine wave systems of things are also a very good test when you record and you re-listen. Is as you were saying, if you lose this feeling, physical feeling that is like from the belly button down, you know, then something gets surely lost, you know. And sometimes you can't even see it on a spectrum, you know what I mean? It's like really so subtle on the bass frequencies that it's very hard to catch unless you have a good monitoring reference, a good acoustically treated room and stuff like this. Even though we can always say that, at the same time I sometimes heard some of the most amazing music coming out of a very badly treated bedroom with two tiny speakers. You know what I mean? And I honestly did my very first stuff, like if you like my first album that for me was kind of let's say a quite good ticket to get into this as a full-on profession, earning my life out of it as well. And that came to me really as a surprise. It wasn't something I was really looking for. I was doing something completely else. I was doing research at university, so it was really just a side thing for me. My setup was literally a few little machines I was borrowing from some friends, and some what was it, like Logitech, this kind of like tiny things that cost like $80 in a supermarket. This was my setup when I did that album, you know what I mean? Then I got my first professional monitor speakers when I started gigging properly, you know. So you know, we can talk about very high-end converters and things like this. Sometimes, though, there is a certain fascination also in lo-fi, but not in the sense of like, oh, how cool is the lo-fi? Because it's cool at the moment. It's when you really hear that something is so authentic, you know, like look at the first Burial album, you know. It's clearly something. If you talk to a sound engineer, anyone I talked to, they all told me, yeah, but it sounds like crap, you know. And technically, it's right. It does sound like crap. I sometimes like drop that shit in clubs and stuff like this, and it sounds completely all over the place. The bass is totally loose. Sometimes I pan it to the right and stuff like this. It's really rap, but that is part of an aesthetic. That is clearly part of an artistic approach that is completely authentic, of a very passionate nerd guy somewhere in UK in his bedroom producing that, and it's so clear when you hear it that then it doesn't matter when the emotive content, the emotional content is so strong, you know, then it doesn't really matter anymore. Then I can and these are, it's just different things. And you have the opposite thing of like I don't know, Alvanoto, you know, perfectly high definition thing. It sounds just like brilliant everywhere you are, but it's a completely other perspective on things, you know. That's a perspective based on high tech stuff, you know what I mean? And honestly, where I come from, I'm, even if I do appreciate the music of someone like Alvanoto, things that struck me a lot, it's mostly things like Burial first album or the selected ambient works that are with such an immense emotional aspect of it, where you can kind of feel that the guy, like Burial, was for me like almost a filter of what it feels to walk in London when you're feeling in a very dystopic way at night, on a Tuesday night where it's completely desertic. You know what I mean? And for me, that's priceless. It doesn't matter what tools you used, how high definition it is, if it sounds like crap or not in a club, but like it's still endless, you know? And yeah, it's so in a way, it's I always try to, for example, going back at the story of myself, you know, with the when my first album was like that, then I realized that I spent some time of like, oh my god, I should now that I have some money and the gigs are bringing me some income, I should kind of catch up on all those things I could do if I would have that equipment. This is complete bullshit. You know what I mean? Honestly, like, and after 10 years of doing this professionally, trust me, it is bullshit. Like, it's mostly, I don't know, mostly I tend to find myself more and more coming back to very essential things. So of course I have a great pleasure if I have like a great monitoring system where I can really work properly on frequencies and stuff like this, but the important is not to get lost in that and to keep in mind that the main core point is another one, and it's the emotional side, the one that comes from like translating life experiences into music, you know. Yeah. Anything else? Yes. Mm. That's an interesting one. Actually, normally what I do is to kind of go by machine groups, meaning like somehow I connect together different machines in one go so that they can kind of start, let's say, a discussion between them, you know? Like, and normally I have that group that for me represent a whole series of harmonics or emotion or creative content, you know, that can somehow later fit together, you know. Then I, even if I record them separately, I still know that they're part of the same palette, you know. And I record, normally in my workflow, I record so much of those palettes, you know, in certain, like Ableton project, I have really databases of things that I record, of like synth flows, you know. And then at some point, I know that all of that can belong to the same concept. That can be an EP, that can be an album if the corpus is really significant. But I tend to stick to that and not adding too much stuff from the outside. And if sometimes I feel, there is this hi-hat missing, I forgot about it when I recorded that, I prefer to keep working on that audio material to really twist it and fold it until I can get even a hi-hat out of it. You know what I mean? That's because I find that to me, again, this is something that having a record label kind of taught me, like that I find the most interesting music when I hear a certain coherence, you know, when I hear like, yes, there is this classic hi-hat, you know what I mean? But it doesn't feel like it has just been added on top. It feels as part of it. And that's not just about mixdown, you know? It's also about like sound source and how you get to that hi-hat, you know? So that's why I normally tend to, for example, use very, I actually don't use much of classic, like drum machine in the classic sense, you know what I mean? I prefer to, with multi-layering, creating my own kick drums out of certain like square waves mixed with sine waves, mixed with triangle waves and things like this, or having hi-hats coming from just equalizing and cutting completely something that was, for example, a bass line for them as 20, and where I had this like weird noise of that you could barely hear, and then I push it to the extreme over like 3 stages until I have a proper beautiful kind of white slash pink noise. So a white noise that is not just the flat, but that has some character. And either it's my imagination or I can really feel those things, you know. And I normally try to find my elements out of those palettes only, and it's really an act of discipline. Sometimes I'm like, oh my god, it would be much easier instead of spending 3 days trying to do that to just sample Hyatt and put it in, like, but it's just a result, and it's not the same. It's not the same corpus, you know, the same animal, you know, like entity that works. Yeah. And I guess that's also coming back at the roots of dub music, you know, where it was pretty much about that, where we like 4 acoustic instruments. That's how, for example, Lee Perry was working. Like he was working with just a mixer and some sounds and effects in one room, and the different musicians in single closed rooms, each of them with headphones, you know. So the drums, the bass, the voice, the guitar. And he was like getting the signals and on the mixer starting to be creative, not just in the way things were coming in and out, but also in the way he was equalizing them, overdriving them, sending them to a whole chain of effects. And then that's why when you hear a track by Lee Perry, it sounds really alive, you know, without the need to add anything else, add any special effects or things like this, you know, or crazy compressions on the drums and blah blah blah. Like it's still like wide and immense, because yeah, that's how it is when you once again try to work with a limited palette and try to really push it to the extreme, or at least to the extent you need for your own idea, you know. Yeah. Yes.
You talked a lot about pushing machines and hearing things that you find interesting or curious, and then moving into that. Are there ever times when you're working on a body of work or composing something that you have a specific intention that you're looking for, or a more intellectual idea that you're pursuing, and does that change the way that you work?
Let's say I do have, not in terms of sound aesthetic, what I do have is some kind of more intellectual grids, meaning like it's almost like ideas that, or things or notions that for a period of time start to really chase me, you know, like I start to think about a certain aspect. So let's take an example, the album I did a few years ago called Churches, Schools and Guns, you know. That name came from, of course, traveling to the US, talking about churches, schools, and guns, and it was just this image that was like so stuck in my mind when I just arrived at the airport. I had like really tough security control, no sleep on the plane. I was coming from other gigs in Europe. It was like really destroyed, you know. So I was in the car with the driver going towards the hotel in this like semi-lucid state, and at some point I just look around I think it was in Denver or something like this, like really quite deep somewhere, like let's say, and I saw in this complete vastity of nothingness before the city just this series of things like a school, a church, and a gun shop, like one on the side of the other. This is the kind of inputs that then chased me for a long time, you know. And so I was like, it was I was dreaming of it. I was having nightmares of it. I was thinking about it during the day, and those becomes, let's say, things that start to generate a certain mood or vibe inside me. And I normally try to really cultivate it. I don't like push it away because it feels bad. I'm actually like, this can be interesting. So, and on that side, yes, then I work on music, keeping that in mind. But it,
Like, is that something that once you have that image in your mind, it starts to generate sounds?
yes,
How you can produce
it does.
hear it.
It no, it does. It does start to generate sounds to me, like, or at least a sound aesthetic that I know that the mood of that particular album of that track will be that mood that I'm feeling in in that period. But I do not have a thing like, I want to make a track that sounds like this, like in terms of like actual acoustic sound aesthetic. That, yeah, never, pretty much, yeah. Mm. Yes. 16, which one was it? Wait, I'm really bad with years and memory. So, so nice one. Self mythology. Okay, yeah. Self mythology was actually an album that I did when I started to work a lot on, let's say, self development in a way, you know, when I started to do a lot of more like inner practices and things like this, a more intimate space that I started to carve for myself in my life. Then let's say during those years there has been a lot of things that started to pop up from my childhood and things that I really completely forgot. Like, and so self mythology, it's even called like that because for me it's some kind of masked, hidden auto biography, you know. So it's like title by title is kind of the history of certain facts, good or bad. Some are really bad traumas, some are really epiphanic experiences that somehow I feel they have been like main chapters of my life, and those were, I think, were 10 tracks that developed like this, you know. So that was like actually, to me, a very, very introverse album that also came out of a moment where I was, yeah, completely, well, yeah, to the limit of being sociopathic, honestly. Like, so I was really cutting myself completely out of the outside world most of the time, and that's what came out, you know. So that was kind of a really intense album to make, let's say. It, yeah, yeah. Mm. So we going with some music? Yes. So yeah, so let's try to make, for example, something fun could be just a simple sequence. So we can start working a little bit with some basic sequences from the SQ10. So the SQ10, as I was telling you, has this. What are you? I don't know. Has this 12 patterns, 12 steps architecture. Wait. Okay. So 12 steps architecture. And you have pretty much three. Wait, I try to show it. So you have these outputs here. These three are simply the CV outputs of each of these lines. So the first one is this one, and this one. Tac, tac. And this one is the only trigger output. So CV output, that means, let's put it very simple, the notes you want to play. And trigger outputs means the steps, when they are, how fast, etc., etc. And let's say it's a bit, it's very limited because, as you can see, it doesn't really have any buttons, so has nothing of a step sequencer, even if it is a trigger output. That means that you cannot actually turn off certain notes, you know. So theoretically, they are constantly playing, but what you can do is to giving each note a very negative value to go into a value that is so low that you don't hear it. That's how it works. So I will connect for example, the first row to the hertz per voltage input of the oscillator of the MS-50. Hertz per voltage because Korg uses was using a different protocol than the classic one from Roland, for example. So the classic one for Roland is the one that you see below here, where it's, let's say, 1 voltage correspond to 1 octave. While Korg use a different one, where it's about hertz per voltage. So let's give it a listen so we know what I'm talking about. So let's bring it all down first. Portamente down. Okay, so a little bit more volume and so as you can see, for example, from the first step, now we're hearing a sound. In the others not, because they are all at such a low value that we actually don't hear it, but it's actually playing the VCO. So what happens when you record this and you look at the spectrum is that you have something on the 10 hertz that keeps on. So when you do these kind of things on these old machines, remember to clean up that sub if you don't want a mess in the final mixdown, of course. But it's interesting when you go into the limit of what that oscillator can take. You start having these really weird clips. For example, I wanna now cut the sequence into something shorter than 12 steps for now, at least. So what I do, I have here a reset trigger input, and if I plug it to one of these trigger outputs, it will just like stop and restart right where I plugged. Okay. I'm adding just some delay to it, maybe some reverb as well. For example, what you heard now is a what you heard now, this is just a thing of the mixer that is probably dusty and old. This is something I would surely have taken. That's the kind of very beautiful form of white noise that I would like to have. So maybe if I have a crackling knob, I wouldn't always fix it straight away. I would maybe use it to record that stuff, you know? So yeah, that's an example of what we were talking about. See if I can repeat that. I would just send it in overload at moments and do my own groove like this, you know, and record this. And I can tell you, I could already make a whole track out of what I'm doing right now. Let's add some more effect chains. So what I'm adding now is just a very interesting machine, which is the retroverb, which is pretty much a very beautiful kind of advanced form of spring verb. So a spring verb is a reverb that is not like this one, that is very beautiful too. I really like the Aventine stuff. It's digital, extremely, can be super beautifully crystal clear, mega long, creating these rooms that normally you cannot have in the real world, you know what I mean? So because that's what reverb is. You kind of create spaces with reverb. You know? A spring verb is actually fully physical modeling. So real emulation of a room because of the spring the sound passes in. You know, so the springs start to vibrate literally inside a case. So it's like a miniature of a real world room, you know, that's of different size and stuff. You can also crash it. Yeah, for example. Back in the days you had to do this, 1 second, let me mute this. I don't know this mixer, so I'm a bit slow with it, but back in the days to do this, to do this, this, if you are familiar with dub stuff, you surely recognize this sound. Like this started happening because people like Lee Perry started sometimes when they were actually too high to hit their their stuff, you know, and they discovered that they could actually crush the spring. So when you have a spring tank, you can do that literally by banging on it and then immediately amplifying for a moment this reverb space. On this one, they had the great idea to put a crash button that probably hit with a hammer very strongly on the spring. So that's interesting, but yeah, maybe it is. And as you can see, as you can hear, there is some form of like filtering LFO going on, which is happening here. I'm just like putting this LFO at a very, very low speed so that it goes very slowly, and allowing the resonance of the filter of the spring verb, because it has a filter inside, to start self-oscillating just a little bit to give this some more overdrive to it. The only thing that I don't like here is that they call the character of the filter balls, which I find quite very macho to do, but yeah, whatever. That's this is like just an example of how with a very, very simple thing of the 4 notes that we'd even look for, that we just heard, it was like sounding weirdly crackling. We could already do a lot of things. So let's try to work a little more on that. For example, adding some white noise. Or actually, even better, we could put the signal first of all into its own adding amplifier, so this kind of mixer system of the MS-50, and then out, so we have some space in other 2 channels to add some more stuff, you know. As you can see, sometimes it goes in overdrive, but the overdrive is this kind of machines. It's very beautiful and harmonic, so I leave it as it is, pretty much. I'm gonna use the second line of the second CV of the second row, so the CV output B, to drive some notes on the Korg MS-20. So I plug it into the both VCO 1 and 2 input, for example. And then we need also the trigger, so as there is only one well, it doesn't matter right now, so yeah. Here what's happening to the oscillator. This is because, once again, we're playing with very old machines. Probably something is getting warmed up or something like this, and you can just find and change your frequency where you like. Go for 2 extra steps. This is the MS-20 coming in now. Just equalizing a little bit the effects so we don't have too much bass overdrive. Playing a little bit with the filter until I found some movement of the filter that I like. For example, this high pass filter. Which sounds quite good because when I open it completely, the high pass filter leaves a lot of space to the MS-50, and then MS-20 can come in with the more bodily part, you know. And this I can easily automate it using the modulation generator. Adding just some fine tuning, let's say the effects. Something is definitely happening to the MS-50 oscillator. It's starting to fall down slowly. So this is just an example of how to very simply play around with things. As you can see, the patch here is extremely simple, but once again, like we have scenes that are in a way very limited, tonight even more limited because I feel like this MS-50 is about to die, but still like on one side one can think, oh, I'm playing this one I got tonight, is quite a crappy mixer, you know, but I kind of like to work in those settings, you know, because then what you can do is to proper, very clean mix down, to really cut out the parts that you really like, but still you will have this really intense character, you know what I mean? Like, consider that albums that has been like it or not, you know, it has still been seminal for the dance music, Daft Punk Homework, you know, that back then actually I was very enthusiastic about. I was 15 or 16 or something, but was made on a very crappy 8 channels Mackie, you know, and I know that for sure. I've been living in Paris with some people that has been very close to the two guys, and I know this is not a urban legend. They really did it like that, you know. So once again, try to not think too much in terms of like how cool is your tool, you know. Like it doesn't really matter, like in my opinion. But yeah, let's go back at some sound. I'm adding just some the second oscillator now, tuned quite high. This is the kind of, for example, sequences that people like Luke, for example, Luke Sater, when he does planetary cell system stuff, he kind of love this kind of very monotone, repetitive, cut that short loops, but they still have this, to me, his productions, for example, has this incredible, I don't know how to define it, amplitude of sound, you know, even if they are, in my opinion, still recorded with this kind of tools, you know. So once again, try to the most beautiful things, the most effective things to me, on both the emotional level, the dance floor impact and things, are things where from the idea to the track has to be the shortest path possible. You know what I mean? So, and that's a big issue, for example, in my opinion, with the modular stuff, the Eurorack. I love it. I've been producing a lot with it, but I also notice its dangers, you know. So it's a great compositional tool, but I also saw a lot of people getting kind of lost into it in a bit, you know. And you know, there is one side of it that can be very interesting, but once again, it depends on what you want to do. So first of all, in my opinion, have the clear idea on your direction and target you want to get to, you know, like, and then decide if you wanna spend most of your time actually researching on like how to make it the function as complex as possible, and the self-generative patch and things like this that is endless forever, and I show up in the studio the day after and it's completely something else on its own and stuff like this, which is a lot of fun. But then it's to me, I always never want to lose the point. For me, making music is about communicating to people. You know, that's what it is. That is my very most authentic social life is through music, meaning like it's the music I do, the music you listen to, the music you do, and I listen to it, you know. So that when I kind of lose that, I just feel that I end up in things that are very sterile, you know what I mean, and that is doesn't feel like really, this is a Lucy production, you know what I mean. This is what I want for the Lucy part of me, you know. Like, any questions about so far? All good? Yes. Let's go on a little bit more then. So. Let's go a little slower and let's start to add some more stuff. First of all, I would like to bring the to multiply the trigger, and to do that, actually there is a very interesting thing on this MS50, which is this down here, this junctions they call it, which is pretty much a multiplier, to go simply. So you get there with your output of the trigger, for example. They go by group of 3. So I plug it here, and then I can have it coming out of the other 2, very simply. And we go to the here. So what I'm doing now is to have one that goes to the trigger input of the MS20, and the other that goes into because in the MS20, the, as we were saying, the envelope generator in this case is already pre-patched. So if you're not familiar with it, the normal sound path will go, the normal function path that is not the sound path will go to create envelope, so to create an actually attack, decay, sustain, release system for your sound. You need a trigger, so you need the sequencer that tells him this is when the envelope starts, you know. And in this case here it's pre-patched, so we're working with a pre-patched system. But on the MS50 it's not, so we have to patch it. So what's happening is that I'm bringing the trigger output of the SQ10 of the sequencer into the multiplier. From the multiplier I'm going to feed the trigger input of the envelope generator, okay, in the MS50. And then with the envelope generator, I will feed the actual amplifier. So the envelope generator is just there to tell you this is the shape I want the amplification to have, let's say. Yeah. If I'm not clear, tell me. Yeah. So we plug also the signal to the control, the envelope generator output to the control in. Wait, let's just hear the MS50 for now. So, and then we bring the signal output before going into the mixer, goes into the actual amplifier. And from the amplifier, wait, let me swap the cables. So we have the signal that is coming out first from the VCO, then going into the filter, from the filter into the VCA, so to the amplifier, from the amplifier into the mixer, then connected to what we are hearing. And again, I'm feeding the the amplifier with the envelope generator. So what I do now is to add some intensity and having more control on the shape, you know, of the amplification. For example, very short envelopes. So to this again we come back with the delay, some reverb, not too much. Some spring verb. I add some overdrive from the spring. You see what's happening now, for example. I was just checking how the filter would sound by opening fully the filter of the actual MS-50, and then I found out that when I close it too much, you see what I mean with surprises? This is not particularly something I like, but just to say that sometimes things that are supposed to be for a certain scope, they can be used for others depending on how you start to use the machine. And what's happening here is just that what you hear is simply changing in pattern and rhythm. It's actually simply the actual sound of the oscillator disappearing and the actual sound of the self-oscillating filter coming in. Then in that case there's of course no notes because there is no CV controlling it. So what you are hearing now is simply the self-oscillation of the filter. And then I bring back only that it's, you know, can be interesting also for variations during the track, you know. Only that you could never ever say if you hear this that it's someone closing a filter changing the pattern, you know. That's what makes it alive to me. Back at them 50. Just playing a little bit with the filter settings. Add some of that modulation generation also to the low pass, not just to the high pass. To give it even some more movement and put it even slower. Changing the tune to see if I find some harmonics that I like more. Putting the second oscillator as a square wave to give some more distorted or some more bold harmonics. Because remember that a filter is always much more clearly effective the more square a wave is. Of course, when you filter sine waves, you don't have any spiky harmonics. You know, when you filter a sine wave, yeah, when you filter a square wave, of course the filter can work also also as a resonance machine, you know, in a way. Some samba. Because tempo is also not just tempo, you know. Something about this second oscillator that is really I'm not liking at all. Yeah, but probably out of this, for my own aesthetic, what I would be more interested in what's happening here, since I'm probably cutting this very almost acoustic bass line that is coming out of this. I would probably make it a little less acidic with less frequency changes, like. That I can enjoy for the second line, for the MS-20. And sometimes there are things that sounds in a certain way when they are slow, which I like for this, for the MS-20. This I would surely sample and use it for a nice kind of a little bit Donato style old school stuff. And consider that this, if I was hearing this, I could say like, it's some old Roland CR78 drum machine. This one that has like this pre-made patterns that sounds really weird. But remember that we're just working with pure oscillation right now. That's once again to come back at how maybe you don't need a drum machine, you know, like because you can achieve very special things using other tools to get there. And we got there also by chance, you know. That's what I'm trying to do tonight, is to kind of bring you into my mood when I'm alone in my studio, you know. So that's so yeah, about this bass line, I'm still very unhappy about it. But first of all, before we go to some more stuff, there was another point that I wanted to tell you that sadly I cannot show you tonight because this mix architecture doesn't allow me to. But normally another very important part of my workflow is when we were talking about overdubbing. So right now what you heard is like maybe putting a little bit of extra effects on the pure sounds we were hearing, some delay and some reverb. What I would do now if I was in the studio is to, for example, develop immediately, this would come to my mind, to develop that kind of MS-50 weird drum patterns, or however you want to call it, through instead of working too much on the actual filter and things like this that would sound a little bit obvious to just like close the cutoff, open the cutoff, close the cutoff, etc., etc. I would work a lot on live dubbing. That means if I would have a mixer like the one in my studio that would allow me to send not only the instrument to each effect, but those effects into each other as well, into a quite complex chain of effects, you would start having really endless amount of variations and opening and closing and folding of the mood. That is an extremely important part of my studio production workflow. We can't do it now once again, but I just want to make sure you understand that how hugely impactful can be a good chain of live dubbing. Once again, live dubbing means not only sending the signal straight to the effects, but to start sending the effect into a feedback system between them. And that's when, to me, really the magic happens in terms of like development of an arrangement, you know. Any questions? Well, I wanted to use it, but we're having some issues, so I cannot use it. But I use it simply as another form of delay, because I normally, as you can actually see from this set of pedals, I like to, let's say, in terms of effects, mix a lot digital and analog world to have a quite complete sound spectrum or a sound treatment, let's say, kind or approach to sound treatment. For example, I would always associate a very beautifully clear eventide delay machine to a very rudimental custom-made tape delay. This is actually a cassette player transformed into a tape delay, because it was either that or bringing a whole Roland 201, so this is lighter. So, this I would work it just as simply as a tape delay. That is something that, to me, it's again one of those machines that, as much as you can try to emulate them in the digital world, at least so far I never heard something remotely similar to an actual tape delay machine. So I would probably pair them up, very clean digital thing, and with endless possibilities of like very clean, endless feedback, and creating even some precise loops and rhythm out of the delay. Sometimes you can use it as a loop machine as well, a delay, of course. I would mix it with something like the tape delay that I can use mostly as well as almost as a synthesizer in a way, because you can develop feedbacks, and what I can actually show you is just feedback of this, pure feedback, because we have some problems with the inputs of it. Wait. This is pure feedback. It's just noise from the tape itself. I think this channel is a little, yeah, but and you have no idea how much stuff I sample out of simply this, really. Tape machines are very fascinating to me. This channel is a little bit frying, but and what I was trying to tell you, for example, to send this same one into the delay, into the digital delay, but of course, as this is quite brutally screwed, this channel, you cannot fully hear what I'm trying to show you. Wait, let's try it. This is also another point that I like to do a lot in the studio, not only to, in this live dubbing, we were talking about to as well send, create this chain of events through different effects, but also to sometimes send after certain stages. So say that the tape delay that is processing something that is coming from the synth is sent to the actual digital reverb, which is sent to the reverb, which is just sent back to the first machine, and that's of course create a feedback. So a loudness that goes higher and higher because you are kind of feeding the same sound again. So it goes exponentially high. And what is really interesting is in that case to use limiters to be able to do that. Also, I find this in live situations very, very useful to go wild without piercing your ears, and to set these limiters so that they can contain this feedback system. And that's very interesting because that's one when you actually create those situations I was talking about, when different signals start to fight to get out, when they fill completely the headroom of the channel of the mixer. With a limiter, there is somehow the sonic state has to choose what pass and what not in which moments. And that's when sometimes you can start creating very interesting grooves out of just effects and ambience, you know, without even having to use a sidechain compression, for example, for your drum part, you know, which can make it very interesting. Another very interesting trick is like to use sidechain compressor, but from a groove that you keep silent on the mixer, so that you can have this extra element of a sidechain that doesn't work as the classic sidechain that is hyper boring when you have like the kick drum and the sound going like whoop, whoop, whoop. That is absolutely horrible. But you can have this other silent pattern that start to play with the sidechain of the limiter that is so creating this kind of grooves and rhythms out of just a mass of sound, and using as the source of that groove something that you are not actually playing to the crowd, but it's just to establish that rhythm, you know. Yes. Are you scratching your head or asking a question? Okay, no, go for it. Yeah, please. Well, actually, soon, because I mean, this configuration is kind of intense to bring around on the road. So well, this is kind of easy. As you can see, this SQ10 is one of the few existing ones that has been modified into MIDI. So it's quite easy going about that. And unless I am in a terrain, let's say, where the sync actually is not that important, so a drone performance, an experimental music performance, unless it's set, if I'm in a dance floor setting, for me a tight clock is really fundamental, because I want to be able to play with the clock once again with live dubbing, but not because the clock itself is loose, you know. So I want to be able to uh, control how I move the sense of speed and tempo through those effect chains and grooves that I can create through that, instead of actually acting straight on the clock, on the sync, you know. So for example, with this new live project that we have with Arose together, called Lotus Eater, actually we are, it's the first time in a long time that I'm playing an actual techno live act, because normally in live situations I've always been mostly into DJing, you know. There was more than enough for me, a shape of music output that I really like to a dancing crowd, you know. And so my live acts were mostly dedicated to more, experimental situations, you know, like special events where I could do something specifically very different. So a drone performance or an ambient performance or things like this, where I actually don't even clock anything, you know, most of the time. Sometimes I do like, let's say, in those ambient situation, more like crowd rock style, certain like feedback, sequence systems, you know. But also, I don't like to overdo that either, you know. Yeah. Any more questions? Yes. If I record in overdrive, yeah, I do. Yeah, depends. If I, to me, for example, that's the beauty of analog mixing boards, is that as usual, analog distortion is really nothing like digital distortion. You know, analog distortion can create very beautiful harmonics. Though there is one point about distortion, is that I have the feeling in techno at the moment, this thing of the distortion is getting a bit too far for my taste. You know what I mean? And so it's, let's say, when I feel that, I normally tend to spontaneously get away from it. You know, even if it's something I was doing, I was liking, I'm like, yeah, there's too much around of it. You know, and it's because to me, when you uh, overdo the distortion thing, what you create is complete flatness, you know? Because, like, for example, what happened to a normal, nice sine wave? Like, this is the shape of the sine wave. The moment where you bring it to the limit, that is this, okay? And you start to press against the limit, this will go in distortion. That means that the sine wave will start to have this shape. Tuck. Okay? And when you do that to all the elements of your track, of course, the result is like a brick in your face system where there's no more dynamic. And as I understand the aesthetic sense of it, it has a sense, it has a history in part of the rave culture and things. Still, to me, the things that really makes me feel something strong are things where, like, the dynamic range is very important. And dynamic range means how much the track actually can breathe. You know, use of silence in a track is very important, of like empty spaces, you know. That's to me something extremely important that can also be brought to the extreme. See, for example, I don't know, a master in this to me is Ricardo Villalobos in his productions, like in the use of silence in track productions. You know what I mean? It's just so beautifully and intensely done that those parts of silence are very actually full and charged of sonic meaning to me. You know what I mean? That's so yeah, the overdrive, yes, but with a lot of care. You know, like, because I at the moment I know in the techno scene it's very highly fashionable, this all full-on distortion system of things, you know, is just not something that ring a bell to me, you know. Particularly when I see that is like not done with a lot of care, meaning like it can be very beautiful, highly distorted music, but I like, you know, for example, see someone in that side that I really like Empty Set, you know, like they use distortion in very extreme ways, but you can also feel this insane amount of dynamic range, you know, that distortion like breathe. When you hear it on a sound system, you can really feel it in your belly, full on physically. I'm talking about like in a club, it really moves you away alive from Empty Set. You know what I mean? Like moves you physically, and that's for me a very good kind of overuse of distortion. Other one is just like you know, distortion pedal on distortion pedal on distortion pedal. It's a little bit too brick shaped to me as kind of music. You know what I mean? Yeah. So yeah, I like, for example, to use distortion sometime in the bass range, in the bass frequency range, but also there you have to be extremely careful, because what someone else before was talking about, that physical feeling of movement, when you distort it disappear completely, you know. The purest is the bass, the more you feel it trespassing you, you know. Also because it's really a physical thing, like it's literally a wave that has this shape, trespass a solid body better and goes around it than one that is made like a square that hit and go back to the source, you know. Like that's it's sound is physical, you know, even if we don't see it. I can sometimes see it, I'm sure some of you did too. Like, but yeah, it's still a whole body thing, you know, particularly dance music, you know. But actually even drone music, you know. Some of you might know that I'm very passionate about gongs, for example. Like it's that's exactly, it's so much work on the bass frequencies that is just like this continuous kind of micro massage of your cells, you know, in places that have never been moved before, and that like bass frequency get in there, move things, shake them, and go away. You know what I mean? That's so with distortion, I tend to be very careful in not losing that physicality, because then everything goes to the just straight to the eardrums instead of in my belly, you know. And that's when I feel I'm losing something huge, you know. Yeah. Anything else? Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's like a lot of that work for me is in the treatment of the sound source, as we were saying, like being very careful in not filling the headroom with stuff you don't need, you know. So once again, as we were hearing that sequence, when we don't hear anything, either it's because I really want to keep that very low feeling that in my studio I can feel that moves my belly, even if it's silent, or if I don't want, I'm gonna cut it off with an equalizer and clean the space. You know, that's the main point. Particularly delicate, of course, all the in dance music, the kick drum sub interactions. You know, where I have the feeling often a big mistake is to think that it's like, oh, my subwoofer doesn't is my sub in the track is not sounding strong enough, so I just put 5 dB extra, and that's solved. That's not solved, you know. That's just creating fog in the mix sound. Instead, try to understand where is the frequency range where your kick drum to you is important. You know, that like the part of the kick drum that to you gives you what you want. That is maybe the pick and the strong power. You know, what we call in Italian la pigna. So the pack pack feeling, or you're more interested into the very low round low end part of it, and then try to make space in your other synths sub frequencies where you want the importance of the kick drum to be, so that the kick drum can actually pop out, and you can do dynamic. Yeah, exactly. What he's saying, it's also very important that it's like, instead of working simply as I described, there would be a very static way, meaning that throughout your whole track there will be that hole. What you can do is to work with dynamic EQing. So certain EQ, this is more on the digital realm normally, even if there are ways to do it also on the analog realm. But mostly in the digital realm, you can make it so that the equalizer gets that curve, that hole, get activated only when a certain other trigger happen. There can be a certain level of the sound you're feeding. There can be a sidechain system. There can be a million other things. Yeah, or it can be, once again, something that you decide to keep silent in the track. So it's just to create a certain groove, you know? Yeah. Yeah, so that's one point. Another point to me is also the huge difference in mixing out of the box. Not everyone would agree with me. Just like I had the trillions of talks with people, with other artists about it. For some people, it's really not important. To me, I notice, at least from the way I produce, huge difference in the amount of headroom and of this dynamic range when I bring everything out of the box. Just even in the crappiest mixer, but outside a laptop where I record with Ableton, you know, like the already separating those lines. I don't know if it's just like a placebo thing that mentally already start to work automatically in a certain way, feeling that physically, subconsciously already feel physically each of those parts has its own physical space on a mixer, and so I work in them in a way, or it's actually true that the mixing outside the box give you automatically headroom. Not sure what's the answer, but it really works for me, you know? Yeah. And there are some other very talented producers here that can tell you the same, probably. Yeah. Yeah. So, yes. So, yeah, compression. That's a interesting and delicate one. Meaning, honestly, at the until the mix down level, I tend to use as little as possible, just because I know how compression can really be sonically amazing, you know, and can often trick me into thinking that that's exactly what I wanted sound-wise. But actually, I find it very hard for me to almost control it. Maybe it's a personal thing, you know, so I tend to really self-discipline myself in leaving that to the very last stage, so that if in a clean and pure mix down, when I did the whole EQ thing, levels as I want them, and the whole, I'm happy about the whole dynamic of an arrangement, at that point, if I still feel that there are some issues that I cannot solve in any other ways, then I go to compression, you know, and I try to work, with the subtle side chaining or things like this to allow certain things to pop out, or vice versa, you know. But normally, the compression is something I happily leave in the hands of the mastering engineer, honestly. Yes. Mm. Normally, mastering engineers really thank me when I send you when I send those, because they are at the moment, it's really, since a few years, it's really like war on loudness, you know what I mean? And I get it, like, if there is the war on loudness, and you like to be there in the scene and you want to contribute properly and communicate to your fan base, you have to still use the codes that at the moment are available, you know what I mean? So, but if you get there with an original track that is very dynamic, the impact will be extremely different, you know. I normally work very close with Giovanni Conti, mastering engineer, that knows very, very well what I do since many years. He was like one half of the DADAP guys before. Now they split up mastering and DADAP project, but that's another story. What I normally give him is a track that at the end is when I hear the mix down, it sounds like really low, really dull almost, you know. Because what I do is to, on purpose, because I know that as soon as you push with the mastering, the first thing that comes out are white noise, distorted things, like all those things. So I keep them kind of dull, you know, and I keep a final dynamic range when I can of around like 9-10 dB. Dynamic range means, for if you don't know, is the pretty much the difference between your average sound output and the peaks. Okay, so this part of between your max loudness moments and let's say the average sound is what we call dynamic range. This dynamic range is what makes a track breathe, pretty much. Like, and so yeah, I normally give a track that is finally even like sound at -6 dB. So if you hear it, it sounds like, oh, it sounds so, you know what I mean? But it's because I know that once the mastering process, if you have a trusted mastering engineer, which if you're a producer, I strongly suggest you to create that relationship with someone, because it's massively important. Then yeah, you can give a track a -6 dB and allow the master engineer to have space to work on your track. Because often, like, I get certain demos and I put them just by curiosity on like Audacity just to see the spectrum, and I'm like, you know, it's just like literally a black brick, you know what I mean? I'm like, where is the, like, how come it's a techno track and I cannot see with my eyes where the kick drum is, you know what I mean? Like, it's so this is let's say this what we were talking about with the hyper distortion fashion that is coming, this kind of nostalgic part of the 90s that has been, in my opinion, overdone already, you know what I mean? It's even favoriting even more this, you know what I mean? And that makes it sometimes difficult, because you're like, you're at the mastering session, you're like, oh my god, this sounds, I like those warm subs, but if I keep them so warm, the loudness would be, of course, a little less impactful, you know, so your call, you know what I mean? And that's why having a open discussion with your mastering engineer is very important. It doesn't matter how well you know him, you have to listen to it with your ears. That's why I'm like, if you're doing a serious project, really invest your time and your money in going to an attended session. You have to be very happy about your final output, because the mastering to me is like a it's not just just mastering like in cinema, you know, we're talking about electronic music, so it's always in between mastering and post-production, you know what I mean? And so it's like a final paint that you give to the track. And for me, for example, with Stroboscopic Artefacts, with the label, one of the real keys to keep something coherent over almost 10 years now has been has been to never ever change the mastering engineer, but instead, if you're unhappy, discuss. Like, has been always the same person, because once you get to that level of conversation and to that system, it's still like this painter that gives to all these different products from different artists one kind of similar tone. And so you have an album by Canning Ray, or an EP by Afdemin, or an album by myself that, yeah, are still very different, but somehow to me they sound like a Stroboscopic Artefacts release, and that's extremely important to me, you know what I mean? That's why the mastering aspect is incredibly important to me, you know? For me, they are like the silent heroes of electronic music, you know what I mean? Like, because mostly it's the artist that takes credit, but when a mastering engineer knows what he's doing, and I like, for example, when I have trust to leave space for so-called creative mastering. So it's not purely equalizing a little bit the track and putting it there. It's really like people must know that it's actually a sonic choice what's happening in a mastering session, you know. Yeah. So yeah. Yes. I do, yeah. Uh, well, a bit of both, meaning like gongs, it's something I sampled since a while, like, and used in my production quite a bit, because they have quite a full spectrum of a lot of very rich harmonics, subharmonics, overtones, and things like this. That then you can really, through accurate equalization, cut the parts you want, and it's extremely rich in harmonic content, really. Back in the days, I was more of a, like, I go around with my microphone in the park, in the mountain, recording this, recording that. I have to say, recently I'm more and more interested into human voice, but mostly when it's spontaneous and it's without the awareness of being recorded, you know. So I'm much at the moment working a lot of, like, when I'm traveling in other countries where people talk other languages, I just like push record without those people even realizing, and it's just amazing to hear those laughter, super intense stories where you have no idea what they're talking about, but still, like, you can feel that kind of emotional content of it, you know. And so at the moment, that kind of spontaneous level of human voice and human voice in general is it's something that is interesting me a lot. And I notice that is I'm actually not the only one, you know. I've seen in the last few months some amazing work from some other techno artists, like what Blawan did in his last album, for example, with the voice is just like unbelievable. And to me, for example, that is one album that um, didn't have enough enough noise around as it should, because it's really impressive on the level of, like, working on human voice and synth at the same time, like he was a one only machine, and it's like creating a new alphabet, you know, pretty much. And that's and he's not the only one. I really like on the more experimental side the work on of James Chaton, you know, little more niche things, but very, very beautiful things. So yeah, human voice at the moment is core interest, I have to say. Yeah, and that's why I'm also working and releasing a lot of stuff with human voice. Like recently, I released this 10-inch record for this new series on Stroboscopic called Totem series. I called Tarkomania, where I was like sampling a part of a very beautiful Tarkovsky movie that I like a lot. And I once happened to, like, I was actually watching it with subtitles, and there was like this part where the subtitles disappeared, so the original is Russian. And so I was just suddenly, my attention was like swapping from the actual meaning of things to just this visual and sonic experience of the Tarkovsky movie, you know, of Stalker. And it was just like, you know, really complete change in perspective. So I took that piece, like, and I put it in the track in some ways, you know what I mean. Recently there is also something else I will release early 2019, where I've been working actually for the first time, when I asked someone, like a proper theater actor, to read something to me, you know, in a certain way. And that has also been extremely interesting, you know. So yeah, those things are on the table, let's say. Also because like, to me, field recordings in the wide sense, so including human voice, so recordings from the real world. It's like a little bit like stealing a piece of the real world outside and putting inside something that is completely artificial, like synthetic music. You know what I mean? And that's it gives a very, very real, alive touch to things. Coming back at the work Burial did with these things, where he was like not only working on normal field recording, like the traffic, the underground line, the stuff, the airport, but also like working in such a weird way of taking like very pop music, like R&B stuff. Most of Burial vocals are like R&B cuts from like even famous song, you know what I mean, and transforming them completely into this completely dystopic sonic aesthetic, like. So yeah, that's totally interesting to me. Yeah. Mm. Yes. Yeah, of course. Yeah, when we were talking about dubbing, that's based on layers. You mean multi-layering sounds on top of each other? You mean? Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Unless like it's either that um, or things like we heard, like using mono synthesizers to create a whole kick, snare, and hi-hat drum machines. You know what I mean? Yeah. Mm. Anything else? How are we on time, Tom? Yes, please. Yeah. No, you mean like 5.1 stuff, etc. Yeah. I mean, I did in the past. I worked for the 4D sound before it was in Berlin, when it was still the prototype of what you find today in the Funkhaus was back in the days in Amsterdam, when it was still very at the beginning of the startup of it. And back then I worked there. And it was a super interesting thing, but not at the moment. Let's say at the moment I'm a bit less interested than I was in, let's say, exploring cutting edge technologies and things like this. You know what I mean? Like as I was saying, I'm in a moment where I'm actually more and more like retiring into my own very limited tools. You know what I mean? That's so yeah, there was someone else down there. Yes. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So for example, what I would do if I was in the studio is what we heard, particularly that drum pattern or whatever it is. I mean, call it as you want. Right. A moment. So so probably what I would do now is to record the actual synth channel purely and the effect channel separately, with making some tricks with live dubbing and stuff like this, like so starting to send one into the other, see how they sound and stuff like this, and making sure to be careful in always closing the circles, meaning like that if I start to open a filter, I never know if in the arrangement at some point I would want to come back to a closed filter and do it digitally. I don't like it. It sounds really not the same. So I always try, when I do like variations on my recordings, I always try to keep a certain cycle happening, you know. So for example, if I was to do this with the drum, you know, I would also at some point record the going back to how open it was, you know. So like this, so that in case I need some cut and paste of things, I can still have it quite uniform in the way they evolve, you know. So I always try to think about the fact that it's not just the thing that I'm hearing that it's interesting, but that this can change in relation to what happens in the arrangement. So I try to leave my how do you say, palette of possibilities as open as possible by working with cycles. And then with this probably in this moment 3 separate recording, I will start to put them down to add more stuff. Sometimes I like to play with same sequences pitched in different ways and start to multi-layer them. So I would put this together with this, for example, and starting, for example, to have this one more extremely pushed in terms of overdriving, to start hearing those whoosh, whoosh, like all these noise games. And I will probably put, in this case on this one, a compressor with a sidechain based on this one, to see how they start playing together, you know what I mean? And maybe changing the starting point so that they can start to play in different ways, you know. And already there I would have surely, because I can hear that, a lot of very interesting sub situations happening, you know, that would create probably already a groove. And then I would probably try some very soft kick drum with some very short envelope of like a sine wave and a come on, what's in English? Yes. To create like a kind of softer kick drum to give this kind of breathing feeling. And I would start working with that kind of groove. For this kind of aesthetic, I would probably go in a very puristic way, meaning I wouldn't bother adding polysynths, pads and stuff like this. I would just start to try and work a lot on the atmospheres I'm hearing from this, all those little noises and things that are happening on top of it. This is how I would go. Then I would probably, once an interesting arrangement is done, in this case would be probably something very dubby, monotone, quite long with very slow evolutions and things like this. I would maybe pass some of these channels through a tape recorder, give it some more hiss, some more character, and some of this very strange. This is the beauty of tape recorders, is that, like, for example, if you pass one of these elements there, probably I would go with this reverb part, you know. You can push it and send it to overdrive on the tape, and it would start like having this really, of course the tape, it was impossible to bring here. I would have loved to show you that, but it's about like when you send certain things like this reverb ambiances into a tape and you overdrive it, they start to automatically have some strange almost compression like fluctuations, you know, because you literally feel the tape, so it's like this you know, of very physical low vibrations, low frequencies. And then I would bring it back to the arrangement, close the whole thing, start a mix down on my out of the box mixer, and probably at the end calling once again my trusted mastering engineer, Giovanni, telling him to check out if what he hears, if he hears any real issues that can really impact the way it can sound at the end. I would fix those and then give the track for mastering, attend my session, and that's it. That's how I would go for it. Yeah. So particularly in something like this, I wouldn't do something too structured, and this is something that weirdly happen often when I work on the old Korg stuff. On other stuff, I feel more like architectural, you know. But when I work on this kind of Korg sequencers, then it's very often something about the flow of the machine almost to be respected in a way, like to leave it as much as possible in its integrity, you know. Yeah. Anything else? Mm-hmm. One more question, or we all go down and dance. Yeah. Okay. Well then. Uh-huh. Ah, it's a classic Midas mixer. Like not really a classic one because for the sake of speed in the way I process things, and because of how I use Ableton Live as this kind of multi-track record and error arrangement situation, I use the Midas that is also a Firewire output, so that I mean out interface because it's also inputs. And the good thing is that the Midas on its own already has very good converters. So even when I send stuff first through the Lynx Aurora, then into the mixer, it sounds quite good to me. And it's not a neutral mixer at all. It is quite colored, but that's for that dub approach I was talking about. That's a very good thing, actually. You know, you just have to be very careful once again in not transforming too much the very low end, because coloring that means often adding pretty much saturation. You know what I mean? Which can be good to a certain degree, but yeah. So it's a Midas F, the F series of the Midas that I use. Yeah, please. Uh huh. Exactly. Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, that's what happens. Mhm. Anything else? Tom, shall we go down? Okay. Well, thank you so much for the attention. I hope it wasn't super boring. And thank you. Hope this will help you making beautiful music.